Very good. Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Geo Monsoon seminar, and our speaker this week is Pallavi Anand from Open University in the United Kingdom. Pallavi did her first degree, her bachelor, and then a master's degree in marine geology at Banaras Hindu University. Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Geo Monsoon seminar. I'm sorry. And our speaker. I'm sorry, there's a feedback there. So as I was saying, Pallavi did a master's and a bachelor degree at Banaras Hindu University in India. And then she later went on to do a PhD in chemical oceanography at Cambridge. After that, she was doing postdoctoral research work, moving between the UK and the Netherlands, working at the Free University in Amsterdam, at the Open University, and at Cambridge University. She is a scientific leader in our field, and she is presently on the editorial board. She serves as an associate editor for paleoceanography and paleoclimatology. She's on the NERC peer review committee in the UK, and she serves with the Paleoclimate Society within the UK, as well as being on diversity working group for the European Association of Geochemistry. So without further ado, I would like to turn over to Pallavi. Can I ask you all to mute yourselves and turn off your video so as to preserve the bandwidth? And then if you have questions, please put them in the chat and I'll call on you at the end to ask your questions. So thank you, Pallavi.
Thanks, Peter. I guess I just share my screen now. Okay.
That looks good.
Does it? Okay, so now if I go on presentation.
Yeah, you just need the full screen now.
Okay, cool.
Perfect, perfect.
Good. Thanks, Peter. Thanks for the introduction. And I would like to thank you, Liviu and Tara, for organizing this seminar series, which I must admit, whenever I get a chance to catch up on some of those which I can't join in online, has been really very informative. And I've learned a lot, that's for sure. And today I'm going to talk about a couple of projects that has been ongoing for the last 4 or 5 years at the OU. One being, let me get the cursor here. So the first part of the talk is going to about the drivers of Indian and Asian monsoon. That has been done by Cecile, started by Cecile. She's at UCL now, doing a PhD, and our master's student, Jim Thompson, who was very much like to do some modeling stuff. So I'm going to talk about, out of my comfort zone, much more about the modeling than about the data in the first part. And in the second part, it is going to be Katrina's PhD, one of the projects from her PhD, where she looked at the last interglacial and compared the rainfall pattern with the Holocene. I would really like to thank collaborators for bulk of the monsoon work that I have been involved with, and particularly Expedition 353 scientists who have really sparked a lot of original ideas on the ship, which I then followed afterwards. So just to give you an outline, what I'll be covering today, give you a background and motivation about these studies. And in the first part, I will talk about the drivers of Asian monsoon rainfall over the Cenozoic and conclude some of the key findings from there. And then in the second part, if time permits, then I'll show you examples of how we have gone about doing data model integration for looking at the patterns of rainfall across warm interval, and that is for marine isotope stage 5, and then conclude at the end. For the second part, I'll be really showing you some examples and not going too much in detail because this is now published, so you can go and read the paper. Luckily, for this audience, I don't have to describe monsoon circulation, although I do have a slide here. But just to re-emphasize for the Northern Hemisphere summer, as the land masses heats up and the low pressure system develops across kind of Asian continent, you have these moisture-laden air masses that flow towards it, bringing moisture to the subcontinent. Very welcoming, actually, because the heat rises from spring onwards, and when the monsoon rain comes, it's quite a welcome kind of feature in Asia. Having said that, we very much know from the early days that the monsoon is known as reversal of wind patterns. But if you ask anyone on the ground, people would say it's the rain that matters to most. So with that in mind, we look at the rainfall patterns for Asian region in this talk. So just expression of that circulation pattern, which is driven by the Hadley circulation cell, is very much this convergence zone that you see in the northern hemisphere summer, which migrates more so northward in around Asia, Africa, and Asia, and that brings the northern hemisphere monsoon rainfall. Whereas in the as the temperature goes down during winter, the ITCZ, or intertropical convergence zone, moves southward, and it gives in the southern hemisphere summer. That's how it will be. It brings a monsoon rainfall in northwest Australia and in the other parts of the Southeast Asia. Right, so for the first part of the talk, I will focus mainly on the Asian monsoon, dividing into Indian monsoon and East Asian monsoon. As you can see from this figure, the East Asian monsoon, you do have these two kind of distinct rainfall pattern. One is driven by tropical monsoon system and another one from the subtropical monsoon. And it's this kind of complex nature of the monsoon rainfall that brings lots of differences between when we compare between the Indian summer monsoon versus East Asian monsoon. This is something to keep in mind, I guess. So just to summarizing what the drivers are for Asian monsoon. Again, as I say, I don't have to say too much to this audience, but just to note that the external forcing factors like, insolation, solar insolation received on the planet drives this heating of the tropical area, and that has influence on the monsoon rainfall variability. But also, depending upon the time scales that you're looking at, there are multiple factors that influences the variability of monsoon. Okay, sometimes all these drivers also interact with each other, and that influences the monsoon rainfall pattern. And rightly so, all these drivers have been observed in the past monsoon reconstructions. It's not a surprise at all. And it's the diversity of these drivers on different time scales that sparked interest and an idea to explore this further across the Cenozoic, or at least for the last 30 million years for this study. So mechanism of monsoon variability is very much interaction between various factors, but primarily anything that controls this thermal contrast between land and sea, and that has impact on the pressure system that develops on the continent and on the ocean, that drives the monsoon circulation as well as the moisture distribution. So this is something quite important to keep in mind when interpreting any of the monsoon drivers or mechanism for rainfall changes. But another interesting point here mentioned, very nicely summarized here, is the external forcing influences the Earth's climate characteristics, climate systems itself, and that produces the feedback. And some of these climate system feedback can also in turn become like a forcing factor for influencing monsoon rainfall. So for example, here greenhouse gas and also ice sheets can act differently depending upon the time scales and where we are. So it's also interesting so that all this makes it very complex when we were to look at the monsoon rainfall in different area across time scales. So just to really understand the past monsoon variability, thanks to Dick Kroon, who really pushed this idea forward for drilling in the monsoon legs, with help from Peter and all other co-chiefs, which had series of monsoon expeditions that occurred 5 or 6 years ago. And I took part in expedition 353, drilling northwest Bay of Bengal, Andaman Sea, as well as the southern Bay of Bengal. But it's these monsoon expeditions which are going to bring new data, and that will feed into our understanding of the how monsoon behaves in the past. Right. So to summarize what we know from some recent work that has been ongoing in terms of Indian monsoon and its link with different forcing factors, I've just taken few examples because I cannot possibly bring everything in here. And just to show that, while we are moving our understanding forward, we are also having some interesting puzzling problems to look at. So so this is an example where Clift et al. Reconstructed the erosion kind of evolution through time. And when they put in context with the changes in the vegetation published from India, as well as the sedimentation rate changes, it was quite interesting to see that the monsoon changes that was implicated in terms of erosional kind of pattern changes or flux changes was very passively responsive in terms of, if you look at the exhumation or the sedimentation rate changes, they were much bigger in my opinion. But also what really intrigued me was this erosional change around 2 to 4 million years that they observed the similar change wasn't observed in the vegetation itself. So clearly there is something going on that is not somehow connected. Another example from the Miocene, which you heard Stefan talking about a few weeks ago, about this was really interesting, where they found the Indian monsoon rainfall started to increase from around 15 million years onwards, and they also found this coupling between the rainfall and the wind-driven proxies. So this is really interesting that on certain time scales, we do see this coupling between the two components of the Indian monsoon in general. But for purpose of this talk, what really kind of intrigued me was this: when it comes to the drivers, it becomes very complicated, and almost, all of the key drivers were implicated in terms of mechanism that might have driven this change. So this was, for me, it was quite interesting to note. Another very good example published recently is long-term evolution of East Asian monsoon, where this is a modeling study where the past 145 million years of monsoon rainfall was reconstructed. This is something like a snapshot study, so it's not like a continuous evolution, but it's like every 3 million years they were studied. And what was key finding from this study was that it was the evolving paleogeography or the tectonics that drove the East Asian monsoon evolution, and not necessarily, they didn't find much in terms of CO2 having a input into that rainfall evolution. This is something to keep in mind towards the end. So we will probably show something similar in our study. So just bringing it back again, all these drivers makes it very complex to really understand how these operate under evolving boundary conditions. Okay, so my idea when I started generating some data in terms of long-term monsoon evolution was, how do we consider all these drivers? So by the time I have a multi-proxy kind of study, as well as all the other things known, it will be probably, I will be towards the end of my life to really fully understand, or maybe not. But then that's why I was a little bit impatient to know, how do we actually evaluate different boundary conditions for these two monsoon systems, and could we even do it? I wasn't even sure. So I reached out to my colleagues at the OU, some clever people who do these modeling studies and can do all sorts of tricky things, which I had no clue of. And one of my colleagues, Phil Holden, who was kind of, liked the idea, and he was quite surprised that this hasn't been done. And I said, yes, it hasn't been done. It has been done on a shorter time intervals, but not throughout the 30, for when you're considering transient simulations, so last 30 million years in continuum, it hasn't been looked at. So he said, okay, we can do it by kind of doing a bit more clever thinking around how best to evaluate these things. And he managed to find a master's student. So we started to do bits and pieces and get to a stage where we could write these things up properly. So he said we can do it, but we can't do it with the high resolution climate models. We could use intermediate complexity models where we can generate some outputs and then use those outputs to train this emulator. So according to him, there is this another model, which is a statistical model that can be trained by using the actual models to then provide us a bit more freedom and perhaps save time and the computing resources to address some of those questions that I had put to him in terms of how do we really tease out the key drivers under different kind of climate or different time intervals in the past. So with this thought, of course, there are certain limitations of emulator that I will be showing results of. It cannot go beyond what it has trained to do, like a robot. So it will only look for associations or outputs for which it has been given inputs, or it knows how to respond to those changes. So one thing to keep in mind is emulator can never be exactly same as simulator, because it's taking lots of simulation and then it is doing statistics to tell us what is it that's controlling different rainfall pattern. So in order to train the emulator, we had to use intermediate complexity climate carbon cycle model, which is called Plasm Gini. And it's a Earth system model. So it has ocean as well as atmosphere, probably single layer. And if you want to know more about this, the Phil had published 2016 more about the Plasm Gini, so you can find out. But what he was telling me, that because I was asking for, can we not do it on a high resolution models? And he said, you can do it, but it will take you ages. And also not all the things that you want to do can be done. So this is the best compromise that you can get by what you're trying to find out, by using both simulations and emulator to find out the key drivers of monsoon rainfall. Before we could proceed, we had to ensure that this intermediate complexity model does capture monsoon rainfall, particularly in Indian monsoon area, as well as East Asian monsoon. So by comparing output from Plasm Gini, which is the intermediate complexity model for June, July, August, and December, January, February, just to capturing the ITCZ, if you like, we compared it with the National Center for Environmental Prediction reanalysis model, and it seems to broadly capture the ITCZ pattern. Further, we also wanted to make sure that actually we do get the seasonal monsoon properly in the Indian monsoon region, because it's a kind of relatively smaller grid cell. So we didn't want to just miss out or have monsoon occurring like in the ocean or somewhere completely different. So it was quite reassuring that comparing the 2005 and 2015 mean, it seems like comparing a Plasm Gini output with the observation and high resolution simulation, it appears that it does capture those seasonal and zonal distribution of rainfall, which was very reassuring. So in order to train the emulator, we had to come up with lots of simulations. So these are ensemble of simulations with including key drivers, okay? So for both Indian summer monsoon and Southeast Asian monsoon, we had 200 each simulations that were based on different boundary conditions, and they are mentioned like, so for example, land sea mass and changes, and that was primarily to capture opening and closing of Panama and Tethys together. Also, we had two glacial mass. One was LGM being the maximum ice sheet, and the modern to be in the middle, right? And along with that was orbits and the atmospheric CO2 condition that one would expect for last 30 million years. Right, so we go on then to emulate two monsoon subsystems or two Asian monsoon subsystems. And by doing this, basically both monsoon rainfall, primarily driven by the summer monsoon rainfall, I would emphasize this, even though we capture annual rainfall, we also did some June, July, August rainfall reconstructions. And they were all as a function of these key drivers that have been already known and also observed in the past. Okay. So just to summarize then, so how we what were our boundary conditions? So as I mentioned, land sea mass, LGM, orbital configuration for last 30 million years, CO2 from Stapatal was used, orogeny was scaled from, gradually, as well as sea level, and we used two timings for Tethys being closing and Panama closer. So we had to define these in order to, because we were going to have a time series of rainfall. So we needed to tell the emulator what time these things happen, but we could change it and still find out what were the controlling factors based on different drivers. So, right, so the next thing. So this is kind of the main results of this study. And this being where we looked at the total effect. And so that is basically, the total effect is the input parameter so if you were to take one input parameter, and if all the other parameters were known for that particular interval, for example, for the Pliocene, then how much contribution that input parameter will have to the variance of the that we'll see for the rainfall. Okay, so but the most interesting thing is the last 30 million years, and we also looked at the overall forcing for the last 30 million years on the rainfall for both Indian monsoon as well as Southeastern monsoon. While for Southeast Asian monsoon, majority of the bulk of the variability in the rainfall, around 94% of the variance was due to the orogeny. Actually, for Indian monsoon, all the drivers somehow had some input. So apart from orogeny, we had precession, CO2, and including your sea level, which is through ice sheet forcing as well, and the gateways. And gateways mainly was Panama, if I remember correctly. So with that in view, but as you can see, if you went on a kind of a shorter time scale, maybe for the Pleistocene or for the Pliocene, all other drivers had something to play a role, including for the Southeast Asian monsoon, where majority of the variance was because of the orogeny. But if you went, for example, in the Pliocene, precession, eccentricity, as well as the CO2 and sea level all had some influence on the rainfall pattern. So it does change depending upon whether your investigation for the shorter time scale or the longer time scale, and all these different forcing factors also compete. I'll come back to that next. So in terms of time series, just looking at the overall rainfall changes for past 30 million years ago, so this is the emulated Southeast Asian monsoon rainfall. And then we looked at each driver's separate sensitivity of each driver separately. So like gateways, so here Tethys is closing around 15 million years. And then you have these ice sheet changes because of the mid-Miocene climatic optimum, as well as late Oligocene warming, and CO2 sensitivity and orbital sensitivity as well. What is quite striking in here is that you can see overall change in the rainfall between 30 to 25 million year is very much due to the changes in your orogeny. But perhaps also some influence of CO2 can be seen here. Okay, but the period after 15 million years, this is when the Tethys we closed the Tethys at that point, and that had a remarkable difference in terms of, or change in terms of rainfall, and and the same, particularly for the CO2, we were not expecting this sharp change. So it seems like there is some interaction between different drivers at this time interval. Okay. The other interesting thing on this one was the orbital variability pre 15 million years seems to be much much more modest actually. When I'll show you the Indian monsoon output, you will see what I'm trying to say here, whereas it increases after 15 million years. For Indian summer monsoon though, as expected, all other drivers were at play, as you can see. And although we didn't see much change in the, up until 15 million years, after 15 million years, overall rainfall kind of changed much more drastically here. So orbital forcing, as I was mentioning, has a slightly bigger control on the Indian summer monsoon overall across the 30 million years compared to for the East Asian monsoon. The most interesting part, which to me, was actually these competing kind of influences. So after about 3 million years, when post Northern Hemisphere glaciation, what you can see is the CO2 drove the rainfall reduction in the CO2 sensitivity experiment. But because of the ice sheets, actually the rainfall increased. And as you can see, they both kind of somehow competed with each other. And despite this differences in terms of forcing, the overall pattern was driven perhaps by more like a CO2 change. And this change is mainly driven by Hadley cell circulation changes. So obviously we had to, for any of these emulator response, we had to go back and check through simulation to know whether this is real, or can we find a mechanism for how this is happening. It's not about what is happening, it's about why and how it is happening. So then we go back to the plasm genie, which is like a intermediate complexity model, and we took the pre-industrial state and wanted to see all these different drivers and how it influences that change. So if you remember, the 50% reduction in orography made a significant change in the East Asian, makes a significant change in the East Asian monsoon, so it makes it drier. And similarly, we looked at each of these parameters. So so then when we did the single forcing simulation, so for 50% orography, we saw this change. But when we doubled the CO2, we saw this increase in the rainfall pattern for the Indian monsoon, and that was primarily driven by changes in the sea surface temperature, or sorry, surface air temperature, not sea surface temperature. So these were all linked to either the thermal contrast that was present, and that then drove the Hadley circulation. So as I was saying, reduction in orogeny, basically what it does is it weakens the Hadley circulation at the Southeast Asian monsoon longitude around 106 degree east, and that was the main driver that was causing the reduction in the rainfall. So for every forcing or every driver, we had to simulate all the other things. So we had to simulate Hadley cell, how that responded, surface air temperature, if that changed, and all this. So you can imagine we had to do like thousands of simulations in order to really confirm that how those changes are occurring. So next interesting thing I thought for this audience would be to as the influence of Panama. So I wasn't expecting this, to be honest. So when I was told that actually Panama has influence on through the remote teleconnections, because on the millennial scale we have seen a lot of examples of proxy records where there is a northern hemisphere, or at least North Atlantic teleconnections that happens on the monsoon. So um, I wasn't expecting on this time scale, but it was quite interesting to see that actually. So we simulated three different Panama state. So one is closed Panama, another one is shallow, and then the deep Panama opening. So open Panama clearly had an influence on the simulated Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, and that had influence on Hadley cell, and that reduced and that moved the ITCZ much more southerly, influencing the rainfall in India. But Panama had, as you can see, maybe barely on this one, closer of Panama had very little change on the East Asian monsoon. Right, so just to summarize this first part of the talk, we looked at the long-term evolution of East Asian monsoon precipitation, as well as Indian monsoon precipitation. And as I've shown, the bulk of the last 30 million year evolution of rainfall for the East Asian monsoon is dominated by orographic development, whereas other factors were at play when you were looking at the short timescales like orbital timescales. Whereas for the evolution of Indian monsoon precipitation, it's much more complex, and it does seem to be, apart from orogeny, which is kind of obvious, and we have known that for ages, it was quite surprising to see atmospheric CO2 and precession and ice sheets and sea waves all having some influence. And finally, the two monsoon subsystems seems to be influenced by different drivers and on the different kind of time scales. And I think it's important for them to be considered separately, but also the drivers of the mechanism or drivers of change has to be looked at collectively as far as possible. So this is part of the studies kind of nearly accepted in Nature Communications, but we don't know when it's going to come out. But it contains a lot more detail than I have presented today, because it also involves competing kind of how we teased out different forcing factors, especially when Tethys closure had impact on East Asian monsoon, and changing CO2 as well as changing the orogeny had impact on the East Asian monsoon. So it's quite interesting how different factors played role. So moving on to my second part of the talk, this is, as I mentioned, this is published recently, so I'm going to go a little bit faster in here. And this was work of Katrina, who is in the audience today. She did reconstruct Indian summer monsoon runoff from the expedition 353 samples, looking at the last interglacial around 70 to 130,000 years ago, mainly marine isotope stage 5. And the reason for looking at the warm interval primarily was because, we all know the climate is going to change, improve in certain areas, if you like to hear that, and deteriorate in others. What is quite interesting for me, or not so really, is that the tropics is going to get a lot warmer and the conditions are going to change. And if you are to remember, the monsoon is very much dependent on the heating of the continental air mass, as well as continents and air mass, as well as the oceans as well. But how these things are going to impact on the future of the monsoon rainfall is relatively unknown. I mean, if we call it known, then the uncertainty in future projection of monsoon is quite starking. That it not only that the science can be very different depending upon which model you want to look at, but it could be basically we have very little idea of how this might even change. Okay, so the another interesting point for this audience, or maybe not, is that with all the kind of changes that we are expected to see in the future warming world, you know, it was quite striking that disruptions of Indian monsoon would not have a kind of relatively high likelihood, but also its impact is the massive, and it's at highest risk. Considering the competitors in this are your, you know, um, irreversible meltdown of Greenland ice sheet as well as West Antarctic ice sheet, you know, devastation that's going to happen, or disruption that's going to happen because of the collapse of Indian monsoon is relatively of very high impact. Therefore, as a paleoclimatologist, what we can do is go back in time and try to understand how monsoon responds during the warm interval. So the one that we looked at, or Katrina looked at, is marine isotope stage 5, just to give you a bearing of the climate of the last interglacial. Was, you know, it had changing climate. It wasn't as stable as Holocene, but we looked at the rainfall. We reconstructed rainfall, and then we compared with the Holocene as well. So this is the real data, and the only data probably I'm going to show. The part being, these were rainfall or runoff reconstruction done using expedition 353, one in the northern Bay of Bengal, site 1446, and Andaman Sea 1448. So by understanding a rainfall at a site, you can maybe say something about how rainfall changed, and perhaps allude to something like, oh, the ITCZ may have moved northward or southward, but we wanted to do beyond that. So Katrina very meticulously actually compiled all the existing kind of proxy records that we could use, you know, that had been either are directly telling us about hydroclimate variability, or has been interpreted to be capturing hydroclimate variability. And she divided this tropical kind of, you know, it was between 30° north and 30° south, so that we wanted to capture the whole of the kind of tropics, and just in this study. And then what she did is she divided into different regions, region 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We kept the region 3 with both Asian monsoon subsystems, in fact, including the Northwest Pacific monsoon as well, just for increasing or having enough records to get some kind of representative signal. But you can imagine the data is, you know, with more data, we can do perhaps a bit better job here. And these different colors for the symbols are based on what was used for the average proxy signal, and what was used for the different bits of preparing the different plots for the different anomaly maps and all the rest of it. You can read more about this in the paper because it's out. So so black line in this plot is basically what she, okay, so what she did is, in order to capture the relative changes in the monsoon rainfall, so she took a mean across the time interval, and then anything that had positive, went positive were wetter condition, and the negative were drier conditions. So the red here is demarcates the drying condition, and the blue wetter condition, you know, along the mean. So mean is your kind of zero line is your mean here. And the black is average proxy signal, black line, and the yellow line is the emulator, you know, the one that I talked about before. So we also applied an emulator here to capture this time series evolution of this rainfall. And actually it was quite surprising, and the proxy average with the emulator average, except I don't know what went here, but this is maybe the data gap is there. It didn't quite get it somehow. But it was interesting that in the South American monsoon, it captures quite well. So does the African monsoon and the South African monsoon. The Asian monsoon, of course, it looks quite a large variability. And you can imagine, because it captures both Indian monsoon and Southeast Asian monsoon, but also similarly your region 6, which captures Australian monsoon and the maritime continent. And there are some overlap in terms of data, I think 1 or 2 sites. So overall, it looks quite messy, but if you look at the average signal, it's quite surprising that the average proxy signal matches quite well with the emulator signal there. So she also looked at separately. I think it was me probably forcing her to look separately because of the fact that there were different drivers at play. And what was quite interesting that it does seem like they're kind of slightly different in terms of their response. But overall, again, the average proxy signal and the emulator matches quite well in here. But of course, if we have more, you can look at the number of data points is quite limited here. And there is one which probably overlaps in both. So, of course, with more data, we can do a kind of a better job here. Okay. So the final plot, which I would like to show here is, this is the map basically captures the emulated anomaly map. When I say anomaly map, basically it's the difference between the different, okay, let me start again here. So what she did for different time slices of the last MIS5, took the warm intervals, average of warm interval, and compared it with the Holocene, and cold interval average monsoon rainfall, and compared with the Holocene again. So it's not surprising that, if you compare the cold intervals with respect to Holocene, you are going to see more drying of the Asian kind of, region. And it matched quite well in that respect, of course. But when it came to the warm interval, while the South American monsoon system appeared, stronger monsoon in the MIS5E warm interval of MIS5E compared to Holocene, and same was true for the African monsoon, but for Asian monsoon, and that was a surprise to us. It seemed that it was the MIS5E or all the warm intervals were warmer compared to the Holocene. Another interesting point or observation we had was this rainfall occurring on a broader ocean area away from the continental landmass. And this was observed in more or less in the warm intervals across. And we just thought, wow, if that is, I mean, we are not saying this is exclusively true. If this is to be true, that the locus of the monsoon can change based on the, depending upon the warming or other drivers, then that could have a devastating effect in the future. What was very clear that this heterogeneous pattern of rainfall across, even for the Asian kind of, landmass. And I say this is because when we look at one site somewhere and reconstruct monsoon signal, unless it's capturing the regional rainfall signal, it becomes very hard to say that, I mean, the simple explanation of ITCZ moving north or south may be just about sufficient, but when you compile this type of global picture or get this global data and then look at it, this simple explanation of movement of intertropical convergence zone, north or south, isn't quite sufficient to explain this heterogeneity of signal that we were observing. So that is something a bit cautionary note, that it may not necessarily be enough. And perhaps for the Asian monsoon region, there are other factors at play, much more like a local forcing factors or internal feedbacks that are having impact on the rainfall pattern. So what can really help, and obviously in the next 5 to 10 years, once we have more data coming from all these different monsoon legs that have been drilled 6-7 years ago, with the richness of data, globally, or at least across the monsoon legs, what we can do is we can start looking at the, get a kind of a global picture, and perhaps get in a situation or get in a position where we will be able to look at this, whether we can use the simple movement of ITCZ, or is it much more complex, and particularly the internal dynamics of the land sea changes have impact on the monsoon rainfall itself. And this is probably the hope for the future once we have more data set across, for example, Miocene, Pliocene, Pleistocene as well. We will be able to look at these changes in the rainfall pattern much more in detail. To summarize here, the data, it appears by looking at if we do have data richness, then we can use this data model integration approach to reconstruct patterns of rainfall changes. But of course, complexity in rainfall pattern is there. And even with all the, if I were to tell you that the proxy data that was compiled for MIS5 included all sorts of terrestrial as well as marine proxy records, it's amazing and it's surprising that they somehow did have some kind of similarity in the pattern of rainfall. Okay, with that note, I would like to thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to address. What I would like to plug in here, that while we have done some work in the Pleistocene, there is a bigger group of people working in the Pliocene to reconstruct Indian summer monsoon rainfall, and hopefully any one of them or any one of us could come and give a bit more data presentation down the road. So thank you.
Thank you, Pallavi. Very interesting. And are there any questions from the audience? If you want to put your hand up, you can do that, or make a note in the chat. Maybe just to get things rolling, Pallavi, so the first part, when you were talking about the drivers, were your models at all dependent on like what topographic history you were using for the Tibetan Plateau, or which CO2 concentration model you were using?
Yes, so for the orography, I think that was my first kind of question to the modelers, where can we do like uplift different parts of Tibet and do that? But I think the issue was that the model wasn't high resolution enough to be able to capture those nuances in different parts of Tibet or Himalayas rising at different times. But we did look at the Himalayas separately compared to Tibet. So just to make sure that, and we did see the Himalayas having more influence on Indian summer monsoon compared to Tibet. So that was definitely,
right.
Yeah.
Because recently I've been worried about CO2 and chemical weathering, and it was pointed out to me that actually the amount of change during the neogene of the CO2 is moderate compared to what we see in the Paleogene. And so I was interested that your South Asian monsoon was very sensitive to that.
Yeah. So we use of course, the proxy-based CO2 reconstructions are very sparse. So it doesn't have that, level of, I'm sure I know that there are people working on reconstructing using boron and other proxies for PCO2. And also there are complexity based on, which proxy, Elkanon-based proxy PCO2 reconstruction doesn't always agree with the other PCO2 reconstruction, particularly in the Miocene. So just to alleviate that ambiguity, we just needed something that was continuous. So we used the Stapp et al. kind of modeled reconstructed PCO2, which kind of overall captured the evolution. Because we were interested in looking at the time series, it was important for us to have something that will be evolving with time. So we use that. I guess your question about whether model was dependent on which CO2 record you used, I would have thought probably not. It wouldn't have made a huge difference. But of course, this is something to be tested again, and further once we have a better record or more understanding.
Okay.
Bob.
Thank you. Bob has a comment or a question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, hi, Pallavi.
Yeah.
As you know, I've read through some of this before. Yeah, and I think you also know, because you watched my talk earlier, that our ideas about the evolution of the Tibetan region are really changing quite fast.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is not so much the spatial aspect, which you've just answered, but the timing. Because when I gave my talk, we knew, for example, that parts of northern Tibet were high at the end of the Paleogene. Eastern Tibet was high at the Paleogene. We had these two big mountain systems. But very recently, we've discovered that actually we began to approach a plateau also in the Paleogene. So all the mechanisms, well, all the mechanical forcing or the thermal forcing was all there before the Miocene. So how dependent is your model, given that it's trying to interact with orbital variations and everything else? How sensitive is the model to the timing of the plateau complex being in place?
Yeah, I think you raised this question when you were reviewing the manuscript, if I'm not wrong. And I think the thing is that because it's not a very high resolution model, I must admit, it's an intermediate complexity. So it doesn't quite capture those nuances of different parts of the Tibet. So it just looks at it, probably the grid cell is just going to capture as one bit. It's not going to capture those different parts. In order to do that, I think we'll have to go to Alex and do very high resolution Hadley's had CM3 type of very high resolution models would be able to capture those nuances. But then we will have to restrict ourselves to the very, very kind of shorter time intervals by looking. And I think there has been a study done by I'm trying to remember where they have looked at those changes in the height of Tibet on the very, very smaller kind of scale. But if we were to look at the multiple time scales, and I think it was what I was trying to push for to that high resolution element of it, but it wasn't going to be possible. So I really don't know how much it will be dependent on it, but at least what we have done, it doesn't capture those nuances. It just captures as a continuous orographic changes, if you like, right?
Well, on a positive note, I mean, I'm not criticizing. I do understand about the intermediate complexity models, but I really like the idea of playing around with all the variables and then using some kind of filter. That is a nice approach. Yeah.
Yeah, so we really wanted it because when I started, I had proxy results and I was like, well, I can pick and choose whenever I want my Monsoon to, depending upon the proxies. Proxies are complex too, right? So it was very difficult to know whether what I'm seeing, is it because of the proxy or is it because of is it actually capturing the rainfall? You would expect that, right? If you're capturing some kind of erosional flux, then they are only brought there because of the rainfall, right? At some point. But I think one important aspect that we discovered by looking in the Pleistocene is location is the key as well. Where you are, sometimes using one site approach can be very complex because whether you are, and I think it was very clear in your talk, Bob, when you looked at this Ganges kind of, in this basin, it was capturing a rainfall in a very, very kind of, very dynamical mode, right? In the very kind of small scale in a way, but to use that to say for entire East Asian, you can't do that, right? So unless So we have to be very careful when we reconstruct something and see whether it's capturing the regional signal or whether it's just a location specific. And that could be one of the caveats we can, makes it very complicated, especially when you're looking at the cave sediments and cave records and others. Whereas whether is it capturing just the local signal, or is it really, unless you have a richness of sites and proxy data, then you can say, yeah, this is entirely capturing the whole of the northwest India or northern India in general. So we thought with the expedition 353, because we were capturing Ganges, Brahmaputra, Meghna kind of distribution of the erosional flux, being in the northern part of the Bay of Bengal, kind of it's amazing, like some of these, even the XRF data or something like that is really very nicely captures that evolution of rainfall and changes as well, I think.
Good stuff. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. So are there any other questions? Dick, you want to ask? Thank you. You have to unmute yourself. Dick Kroon, you have to unmute yourself. I can't do it for you. Ah, there we go. Bingo. That's good. That's good.
Yeah, you can hear me now. So you 15 million years ago, or slightly younger, there is this big change that you showed in that graph in terms of
15 million years. Yes.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned the Tethyan closure. Probably it ended at that time, the closure, but it started much earlier. So a tectonic process over long time scales.
Yeah.
And still it seems such a dramatic event. And we know that the Antarctic ice sheet started to grow there after the mid-Miocene optimum. So it seems much more to me like a combination of these two factors having an influence than just that closure.
Right.
What is your response to that? Because I mean, tectonic events take place over a long time scale. So
yes. So yeah, I think that's one of the caveat for the model, because you can't quite, and that was one of the reasons why we couldn't look at the Indonesian through flow, because it started around 25 million years and then kept on going all the way until the Pleistocene event. So that's kind of limitation of the model. I don't think we can look at it on the longer time scale. So that's why the idea was to split the or look at the sensitivity of each driver itself and the combination of different drivers. So what we saw in the East Asian monsoon, I'm just going to quickly look. I'm going to see if I can share this again. Actually, maybe I can try that. Let's see if I can share this screen so that we are seeing exactly the same thing what I'm talking about. Can you see? Maybe not. Yep. Maybe. So you're talking about the 15 million years here, where
I mean, it's a huge event.
Yeah. So the reason we thought in East Asian monsoon, we didn't see this middle Miocene climatic optimum effect in a way, because this change was mainly driven by this sharp change in orogeny. And because MMCO, this is a gradual change, right? So we saw that ice sheet sensitivity did show the reduction in the rainfall in general because during the MMCO. But I think the large shift that we saw here was mainly driven by the orogeny kind of over. I mean, for Southeast Asian monsoon, orogeny just swarmed the whole thing in a way. And as soon as you change that, as soon as you start doing that, it's just, and same was true with the gateway, actually, Tethys is just completely overwhelmed. So we did a kind of a experiment or a sensitivity experiment where what I was mentioning to you, let me see where do I go to that to show that. I do have a figure for that. Is it this? I don't, oh yeah, I have, I think, this one. So what we did then, obviously, as I was talking earlier, that we had to look at the interaction between different forcing factors, right? So with the Tethys closer, so these are anomaly maps, so Tethys open versus Tethys closer. So we looked at the orogeny at 50% reduction in the height of the mountains and the CO2, all three varying. So we did these sensitivity experiments to see. What was quite interesting, actually, that 50% orogeny, if you're at 50, which is likely to be 15 million, around 15 million years ago, reducing the CO2 from 560 ppm to 280 ppm is actually reduced the rainfall when the Tethys was closed. And when you open the Tethys, it went other way around. So when Tethys was open, and if you reduce the CO2 from 560 to 280 ppm, it increased the rainfalls only slightly, but it increased it. So it was quite interesting to see these competing factors. So irrespective of when it actually happened, you could make it a gradual thing. And of course, that would be the proof will be in the pudding in a way. When you have the reconstructions and put in place, you could perhaps see those changes maybe much better. But the idea for here was just to see these different drivers competing with each other. So we did try to do, yeah.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I think now, in view of the time, we should maybe thank Pallavi. Both, you can turn your video on and clap or use your reaction button as you like. But thank you very much, Pallavi. Good job. So I want to remind you all, please, if you to think about coming back next week, especially if you're European-based. Next week's speaker will be Jifei Liu, who'll be talking about clay mineralogy and the Asian monsoon climate and a case study in the South China Sea. That will be on the B schedule, so it will be hosted by Tara Janelle out of Queensland, Australia, so at the earlier time. But as usual, it will be available on YouTube, and I will circulate the Zoom link afterwards, as well as putting it on Facebook. Actually, we have a question. Raj, do you have a question? Somebody's got their hand up.
Raj wants to.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. We've come to the end of the questions today. I'm very sorry. We're just out of time. Maybe you can ask that question privately, Pallavi.
Yeah, I can email.
Yeah, okay. Right. Well, anyway, thank you very much. Come back again another time, and you can always check out what's going on the monsoongeoseminars.com. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.